Good morning and welcome back. We'd like to start out with our second panel, so just so you have an idea of what the rest of the morning looks like. We have two panels this morning and then we'll break for lunch at 12:30. I want to kind of comment that we're doing this not just for what's happening today, but for our future. So we have a very special guest in the room. Go ahead and wave, Miss Catherine. Hello. Catherine is the daughter of Miss Jennifer Link, who is also going to be speaking on this next panel. One final thought, I do have a master email list, so if you could, when you have time, go ahead and check your email, make sure the information is correct, and what we'll be doing is we'll be updating it and giving everybody a copy at the end of the conference. And without further ado, my colleague, Dr. Rick Norton, is leading the second panel.
Well,
Thank
good
you.
morning. I hope you enjoyed your brief break, and it's a challenge following our first panel, and my office mate, Sean Sullivan. I don't pretend to have the wit, but it is a wonderful thing to be here. That's true. I am not witless. But first of all, I guess introductions. I am Rick Norton. I am privileged to serve in the National Security Affairs Department of the Naval War College. This is my 6th Women, Peace, and Security Conference. Congratulations to all who are here. You've all been part of making and building history, particularly those who are returning. But I would be remiss in saying that nothing would have happened if it had not been for Mary Rom's vision and practical leadership as well. So Mary, once again, thanks for being here. Our topic today is leadership. I can't think of a better topic considering the times we live in. The challenges are immense. Change happens at a kaleidoscopic pace. We have long passed the point where we can provide our students answers. We cannot train them to have answers. What the best we can do is educate them to have the skills to find answers to problems and challenges that we may not as of yet know exist. Our panel, I think you will find, is particularly suited to this task. Ms. Jennifer Link, a member of the Senior Executive Service with extensive experience in both the defense and intelligence communities, will be our lead-off presenter. Vanessa Brown, our next presenter, is a teacher at the Canadian Forces College. She's got some very interesting work and studies, and I think for some people in the audience has a great deal of sympathy because she is also in the process of completing her PhD. So we give you lots of luck. And then finally, LeAnne Howard, who is a student at the War College and will be for several days, and then we'll make the transition to practitioner, where she will assume duties as the NATO Director for Special Operations Plans and Policies. And I can't think, if you look at her, and I encourage you to read the full bios of all our panelists, but I can't think of a better example of a national security professional than LeAnne. So I don't want to waste any time. I'll remind our presenters, please stick to the 15-minute rule or I'll have to turn you off, which I would hate to do, and any more than I have already. And then hopefully there will be time for questions. I know there will be questions. So without further ado, Jennifer, it's all yours.
Thank you. So thank you, Dr. Rom and Dr. Moffett, for continuing to host and to bring attention to women, peace, and security issues through opportunities like this conference. I also want to thank the other panelists here today for sharing their experiences and their perspectives about important issues. I'm personally excited about the opportunity to learn from other women through shared experiences and interests. And I also want to thank my mom, Connie, who is that beautiful woman on the right, for giving me such an inspirational example in her own leadership journey. As a single parent who worked outside our home, my challenges as a female leader today are fewer because of her struggle and her contributions. To the left, that woman pumping water from a well is my grandmother, Charlotte, also a mother who worked outside the home. And I'll note she's doing it in heels, just for your interest. My favorite picture of her by all stretches of the imagination. My name is Jennifer Link, and I am a member of the Senior Executive Service in the U.S. federal government. My professional experience has been primarily in information tech and information security, serving in strategic program management and technical director roles. My passion is working to solve complex problems with data-driven projects, leading creative teams using data architectures, large-scale data ingestion, streaming, storage, and analytic platforms to move mission faster. I've served the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and commercial industry for over 20 years. And like some of you, I typically am the minority in the meetings, in the projects that I lead and serve. As of 2016, the National Center for Women in Information Technology reported only 26% of technology jobs were held by women. I've worked really hard over that time to develop an effective communication and leadership style. Having mentors who I trust and could bounce ideas off of about how to work through hard professional issues has helped push me in areas I wouldn't have considered on my own. The mentors who've invested their time with me have been primarily, although not exclusively, male leaders who've been immensely effective in their own leadership journeys. And while they share their insights and give input about how I might consider resolving difficult issues, I've learned to be mindful about how my response or reaction will be seen as a female leader to those I serve and serve alongside. At times, there's an expectation that women have to operate in a narrow emotional channel to be effective, because if women are viewed as, quote, too emotional, they may be viewed as less effective. This is different than just merely a leadership style. Strong leaders must be viewed as effective, but how male and female leaders are perceived may be biased based on gender. The thoughts, opinions, and views I'm sharing with you today are my own, based on my own leadership journey. And while I work hard to be objective in my views and my work, I, like all of you, have biases, conscious or unconscious. Your leadership journey is no doubt different than mine in a lot of ways, but I suspect that we have some things in common. My goal today is to add a voice to the continuing, and I'm hopeful, growing discussion about effective women strategic leaders. Quote, women are more emotional and less objective in their, oh, that's not the slide I was going for. Women are more emotional and less objective in their approach to problems than men. They are not sufficiently aggressive. Quote, women can't work under the pressures of urgency and special considerations inherent in much of the agency's work. These are quotes taken directly from a study known as the Petticoat Panel. This panel was established in August 1953 at the request of the new director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Allen Dulles. During his early days as director, Dulles met with officers to engage in an open dialogue. The subjects of women and equality at the agency were raised by officers during this meeting, and in turn, he established the panel. The objective of the panel was to determine to what extent there may be discrimination inheriting merit-based advancement for women in the agency and how to address it. These quotes highlight what may have been known anecdotally, that in business, women are viewed differently. But is it true today that women are evaluated differently than male colleagues, and does that difference impact their effectiveness as women leaders? Leadership can be thought of, I will get this right, from three different perspectives: content, context, and process. The content of a leader's skill set changes over time, and as leaders learn and acquire new competencies, the content independent of gender is impacted by the context of the situations and the problems within an organization. And finally, the processes by which leaders employ the content of their skills within the context of the situations as leaders seek out solutions impacting their organizations. A strategic leader has control over the content of their leadership and the process by how they choose to employ those skills in the execution of solving an organization's problems. The context of an organization is outside of our control, and as a result, skilled leaders adjust their content and their process to meet contextual challenges. Stereotypes within an organization are an example of a contextual challenge that can impact how a leader is perceived. And it may be fair to say that everyone has a bias of some kind, but not all choose to consciously take unfair action as a result. Every organization, commercial or federal, I've worked for has stated a zero-tolerance policy for any type of discrimination within most organizations, establishing annual training to equip employees with the ability to identify, avoid, and report discriminatory behavior. And while annual training, required training, is a good contribution to combat stereotyping, discrimination, and bias, there's also unconscious bias that impact perceptions. The subtlety of unconscious bias impacts women leaders as it influences how we are perceived with no basis of our actions. As a result, many women leaders must modify the content of their leadership skills and the process by which they use those skills to account for how different women are perceived. The content of a leader's skill set matures over time to meet various challenges, with some researchers describing core leadership skills such as executive presence. Research suggests leaders who demonstrate executive presence, men and women alike, are more likely to be effective at influencing an organization's behavior and therefore viewed as successful. So what is executive presence, and is gender a factor in how these skills are executed? In 2012, the Center for Innovative Talent conducted a study funded by organizations such as American Express, Bloomberg, Goldman Sachs, and other Fortune 500 companies. It included 4,000 professional interviews, focus groups, and executive interviews. According to the survey, EP, or executive presence, is a phrase used to encompass 3 primary skills: gravitas, appearance, and communication. While all 3 are necessary for executives, there are differences in how men and women apply them to be successful. Gravitas is the primary skill needed by executive leaders, and the top 3 traits to demonstrate strong gravitas are showing grace under fire, acting decisively, and showing integrity. Leaders who lack gravitas are viewed as less effective because they don't have the social skills necessary to set a vision for organizations and execute social power to influence an organization towards a stated objective. Social power is the potential for executives to influence others to bring about change in their beliefs, their attitudes, and their behaviors. When leaders are perceived to be less effective, leaders risk losing the ability to exert influence over those in the organization. As John Maxwell once said, "She who thinks she leads but has no followers is only taking a walk." What experience has shown me is how men and women are required to demonstrate these traits differently, to be viewed equally successful, primarily through varied communication skills. This means women leaders may have the same content as their male skill content as their male colleagues, but the process as to how they execute those skills is different based on gender. I've come to believe, based on my experience, that while research indicates gravitas is the leadership skill, I would argue how well a leader communicates is what differentiates a strong leader from a poor leader. Effective communication skills either enable or disable all other leadership traits, including gravitas, making communication skills the core leadership trait, especially for women. Women must work to communicate in such a way that they are viewed positively, operating in what Sally Krawcheck describes as, quote, a narrow emotional channel, or as likable. A leader's success and effectiveness rises and falls based on her social power and the ability to influence the organization, including the people in it, to move in a specific direction. Yet how women and men gain social power and influence differs through their use of executive presence, especially communication, as a result of unconscious bias. I want to provide an example to highlight this further. In 2003, 2 professors working at 2 different universities wanted to study the correlations between success, likability, and gender. Frank Flynn, a professor at Columbia University, and Cameron Anderson, a professor at New York University, both used a Harvard Business Review case study based on a real-life business owner, Heidi Rosen. Heidi is a California-based venture capitalist with an impressive record of building multiple tech businesses. She has undergraduate and graduate degrees from Stanford University and has successfully worked with Apple and other tech companies. Flynn and Anderson created 2 different versions of the case study. One was the original, detailing Heidi's career and rise. The other featured Howard Rosen. All details of both case studies, such as experience and education, remain the same except for the name and gender pronouns. Flynn and Anderson then asked students to review the case study and provide feedback about impressions of the leaders, including integrity, likability, and effectiveness. Students from both Columbia and NYU perceived that Heidi and Howard were equally competent, which is not all that surprising because the experiences and accomplishments in the case study were the same. Students' perceptions, though, differed significantly in other areas and were the same across both schools, as Howard was viewed as more likable and therefore more effective in his job, and Heidi was considered, quote, more selfish, more self-promoting. Howard was someone who was sought after as a mentor, someone you'd want to hire, someone you'd want to work for, someone you'd want to work with. Heidi was nearly the polar opposite, not someone you would either hire, work for, or seek out as a mentor because she was viewed as someone who was a self-promoter. Sheryl Sandberg summarized this best when she wrote that success and likability are positively correlated for men and negatively correlated for women. When a man is successful, he's liked by both men and women, and when a woman is successful, both genders like her less. If women leaders want to be viewed as equally effective as male peers and counterparts, they have an additional leadership challenge to be viewed as likable, but by peers and those she leads. If not viewed in this way, women leaders put their social power and influence at risk, which may decrease their effectiveness. Presidential candidate Hillary Clinton was dogged repeatedly with the likability question in 2016, even when her popularity was higher than that of President Obama's when she stepped down as Secretary of State. At the time, Clinton offered this observation about how she struggles with being a woman, leader, and likable. Quote, "When I see male politicians pounding the message and screaming about how we want to win the election, I want to do the same thing because I care about this. But I've learned I can't be quite so passionate about my presentation. I'd love to wave my arms, but apparently that's a little scary for people. I can't yell too much. It comes across as too loud or too shrill or too this or too that." Clinton's response reflects what many women leaders have learned through experience. While men and women must both demonstrate gravitas to be effective leaders, women must also be viewed as likable while demonstrating grace under fire. We must be likable when acting decisively. We must be likable when showing integrity. When women leaders demonstrate too much emotion, they are labeled as too something. While male peers may demonstrate these characteristics as pounding tables and speaking loudly while waving their arms, women have learned that those demonstrations of emotions pay negative dividends towards women leaders, and therefore they are perceived as less effective. Sally Krawcheck, a senior executive at Bank of America, wrote in her book, The New Soft War on Power, a book on gender bias in 2014, "I can't count the number of times, the times I've seen men slam something on the table, even throw something. You sort of do a mental eye roll and move on, but I can count on one hand, on one finger, the number of tantrums I've seen a woman throw." Krawcheck describes the need by women leaders to operate in narrower emotional channels to be viewed as equally effective as male counterparts to maintain a level of likability. So you might be wondering, am I hearing this right? Effective leaders need to have social power and influence, gain through powerful communication skills, and move people to action as long as they do it in a way that makes me likable because I'm a woman. Well, historical research supports that statement. But as one Naval War College professor lectured recently, history enables us to think ahead. Movements such as And She Persisted and Me Too are raising the profile and conversations overall about women in leadership. And starting today, we as women, as leaders, have an opportunity to bring greater equilibrium to the measurement of effective leaders and minimize the need for the likability requirement. I have 3 things for you to consider. 1, don't ask for permission to speak up or use polite language, and don't allow interruptions to go unnoticed. Have you ever been in a meeting or discussing a topic with a colleague and were interrupted right in mid-sentence? In a recent study analyzing over 15 years of oral arguments in front of the Supreme Court, it was noted that women justices are interrupted 3 times as often as their male counterparts. With an increasing trend that as more women join the court, male interruptions of female justices increased. Female tenders seem to decrease the frequency of interruptions attributed to the fact that women justices stopped using polite language to frame questions such as, may I ask, can I ask, excuse me. I suspect judges simply were fed up with asking for permission to speak and to contribute to the discussion. 2, don't accept applications of double standards and labeling. Speak up and then speak out. In February 2017, Senator Elizabeth Warren read aloud a 1986 letter from Coretta Scott King condemning then-Senator Jeff Sessions. During this reading, she was interrupted due to a rarely used rule that senators cannot, quote, disparage other senators on the floor. Other senators have criticized peer senators without being interrupted, such as Ted Cruz calling McConnell a liar, without interruption or censure in previous sessions. The day after Warren was interrupted and ultimately silenced, the other male senators read the same letter without interruption or censure. Putting the very partisan nature of this exchange aside, this is one of the many examples of dual standards. And lastly, 3, men work with women, not girls. Multiple times when speaking with male colleagues, they refer to women that they work with as girls. I was in a meeting the other day, and the girl said this, or a girl that I work with said that. This assumes a hierarchy which may be unintended but is wholly incorrect. Women do not refer to the men they work with as boys because it's not true. If you're in a setting that you wouldn't refer to a man as a boy, then it's simply unacceptable to refer to a woman as a girl. When this happens to me in conversation, I respectfully call it out, and I think that is something that we should consider. In closing, how do we move from double standards for male and female leaders and towards simply effective leadership? Leaders need to acknowledge there is a difference in play, work consciously and deliberately towards speaking up and setting expectations to meet higher standards. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to our time together over the next 2 days.
thank you for a brilliant demonstration of time management. Next up, we'll hear from Vanessa Brown.
So I guess to do this right, I won't be well liked. My apologies.
No, don't
I broke the rule. Okay, I promise not to break any more rules. We'll see. My name is Vanessa Brown, and I've had the pleasure of meeting many of you in attendance today in last night's reception. For those of you I have still yet to meet, let me express why I'm here today. I'm a sessional instructor at the Canadian Forces College in Toronto, Ontario. I have the great pleasure of presenting the key points of a paper that I have co-authored with my colleague at the Canadian Forces College, Dr. Alan Okris. Dr. Okris and I teach together at the Canadian Forces College. We teach senior officers, typically at the major rank, in professional military education in a program that prepares them for staff and command positions. Together, Dr. Okris and I have observed barriers to students' learning and implementation of women, peace, and security initiatives, and these obstacles are what have prompted me to speak on this very powerful panel today. For more than 2 decades, the Women, Peace, and Security agenda has become well recognized in the defense and security communities. Women, peace, and security objectives have been articulated through a series of UN Security Council resolutions, national action plans, and NATO doctrine. Along the way, the intent of women, peace, and security has evolved with a degree of conceptual confusion as to what is actually to be achieved and how to achieve it. In the process, faculty at several professional military education institutions, including my own, have expressed challenges in determining the optimum way to prepare senior leaders to be able to achieve the objectives of women, peace, and security. This presentation will provide an overview of the key issues identified by Dr. Okris and myself at the Canadian Forces College and outline our recommendations to help overcome barriers that stand in the way of achieving success in implementing women, peace, and security initiatives. Over the course of developing curriculum towards women, peace, and security obstacles, we have observed a very troublesome obstacle, and this is the presence of diverging agendas. While the adoption of Resolution 1325 in 2000 is generally referred to as the origin of women, peace, and security, the real roots actually date back to the mid-1970s, and parallel actions by the UN and a consortium of non-governmental organizations seeking to achieve global gender equality through the advancement of women and girls. Their efforts through the following decades led to the Fourth World Conference on Women in 1995 and the associated Beijing Platform for Action. This platform called for significant work in 12 critical areas of concern for gender equality, including addressing poverty, health, and education. In this context, it should be recognized that issues in the US and Canada, such as the Me Too movement, as well as calls for more women to run for public office, are all part of the original and broader agenda. While the Beijing platform served as a catalyst for Resolution 1325, the more fundamental impact was the UN adoption of the Millennium Development Goals. Importantly, Resolution 1325 should be recognized as a subset of the broader Sustainable Development Agenda that has been endorsed by all member states through General Assembly processes. Fundamentally, 1325 and the way in which WPS is being addressed through national action plans often diverge from the Beijing platform by focusing more narrowly on issues affecting women and girls in the context of armed conflict and in more fragile or failed states. In doing so, the UN has privileged states and governments and situated them as the primary agents for action rather than the representatives of civil society, and in particular, the NGOs who worked to author 1325 in the first place. Implementation of women, peace, and security agendas has occurred through both national action plans and, for alliance members, NATO directives. Both have created additional divergencies. Cynthia Cockburn points out that civil society organizations had originally helped to author 1325 through strong anti-war roots. However, national action plans have often been co-opted in 1325 for military purposes. In essence, 1325 has often become militarized at the state level. Laura Shepard notes that the more limited interpretation of women, peace, and security principles has resulted in a focusing on making war safer for women, rather than preventing conflict in the first place. Sifting through these conceptual differences has made designing and delivering professional military education for mid and senior level officers far more difficult. The second obstacle we have recognized has to do with the military institution's particular worldview. The dominant worldview held in the Canadian military fosters a tendency to think about gender using a state security rather than human security nexus. The received doctrine in the Canadian context tends to promote the idea of the primary role of the military as warfighting. While narratives of the role of the military have broadened in the 21st century, most doctrine is still framed nevertheless through the context of a spectrum of conflict. The net result is that the focus for action remains on state or physical security, positioning the state and state structures, including the police and military, as central to maintaining or imposing peace and order. A differing approach gaining currency is the idea of human security. In contrast to state or physical security, this framework is centered on individuals and families with an emphasis on social and community systems that enable people to have a productive life. The most crucial difference pertains to who gets to determine whether an appropriate level of security exists and who is empowered to say what security looks like to individuals and families. The third obstacle that we've recognized is the tendency for doctrine to equate gender with women. As a result of this false equation, military leaders have had difficulty discerning the differences between barriers that women face, vice gendered inequality, and gender dynamics in peace and security. Prevalent narratives from the Beijing platform through to women, peace, and security action plans put focus on women and girls, often with a juxtaposition to men and boys. While 1325 works to advance women's participation, power, and perspectives in policy and politics, developing a gender perspective has improperly focused on the problems of women rather than identifying the larger gender systems which create inequality. The critique raised here is when gender becomes equated with women, it ends up normalizing gender divisions and inappropriately problematizes women as the problem to be solved. However, a counter-narrative has been presented in several bodies of literature, including the application of critical feminist frameworks to military institutions and security studies. For example, feminists examining masculinities in militaries propose that the profession of arms has a well-established and deeply embedded masculine culture. The fact that references to gender are almost automatically assumed to mean women is indicative of institutional normalization and standardization of masculine practices and ideas. The more critical factor, however, is that the military is not typically a self-reflective profession. Those serving are not usually encouraged to have deep introspection and to achieve self-insight into how they have been socialized to see the world and how they've come to internalize taken-for-granted assumptions. Most members are not given the time or the tools to think about how the military socializes personnel in very specific gendered ways that members continue to produce and reproduce throughout their careers. The key implication is the recognition that developing the capacity for military leaders to be able to apply gender perspectives in a cross-cultural context can be made difficult due to aspects of military socialization and identity. In particular, the processes of socialization in a profession that does not encourage self-reflection can lead to a range of taken-for-granted assumptions, such as gender neutrality, which can make it harder for leaders to effectively assess gender perspectives and gendered social dynamics in international contexts. Divergent understandings of women, peace, and security objectives, the tendency to view these objectives through a state security or physical security rather than human security framework, and the assumption that gender means women in relation to a masculinized military identity each present challenges for professional military education. Speaking to these challenges and our experiences as faculty at the Canadian Forces College, we provide the following recommendations. First, we propose that professional military education provide broader frameworks for human security. A key aspect of achieving the strategic effects called for in both UN and NATO documents is to move beyond merely ending conflict to setting the conditions for long-term peace and stability. To do so, there is a requirement to move beyond the focus of applying elements of national power and provide knowledge that will assist military leaders in understanding and aligning with the needs and interests of local communities. Second, we recommend a deeper focus on intersectionality. Although developing a basic understanding of gender as socially constructed is a key aspect to be addressed in professional military education, leaders also require the capacity to understand how systems of oppression, such as race, class, and sexuality, among others, compound inequality and add complexity to security challenges. Third, it is imperative to understand militarized masculinities. Despite the extensive literature on militarized masculinities in the Canadian military, very little attention is given to providing military members with the frameworks or tool to understand the culture in which they are immersed and socialized. To a large extent, the focus on material intended to develop gender perspectives is on women and femininity, and regrettably not on men and masculinities, or how these perspectives influence military culture. Fourth, we recommend that professional military education facilitate self-insight. Drawing from human security, intersectionality, and militarized masculinities should lead individuals to develop better appreciations of who they are and how they see their world. As indicated, the profession of arms does not tend to encourage deep self-reflection, and hence the methodologies to facilitate this type of personal growth need to be carefully considered. In sum, the achievement of women, peace, and security objectives requires military leaders to stretch beyond the views that the military has traditionally applied to operations. Military leaders need the kind of education that helps them better understand themselves before they can be expected to understand and aid others. As a result, implementing women, peace, and security initiatives requires those designing and delivering professional military education to adopt new approaches. Thank you.
Well, and thank you. I feel rather like the train dispatcher, 11:15's got to be on time, but a superb demonstration. But it puts the pressure on you, LeAnne.
It does.
And,
It
well,
does.
best of luck in our final presentation, and we'll hear for questions afterwards. LeAnne Howard, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you all, organizers and participants. I think we all agree that prioritizing these discussions is one way to make progress, and we need to see more progress in this arena. To that end, I'm going to be a bit more interactive and conversational in my approach, so apologies up front. But first off, who here has not heard of the Me Too movement? Great. I left a couple of letters spread around the room. Who here has heard of the Me Too national security movement prior to looking at that letter? Okay, about eight of us, I think, give or take. I'm going to talk about that letter specifically up front. I am then going to talk about the broader context of that letter and how it came to be. I plan to share some of my personal experiences and reflections in deciding not to sign that letter after being pushed rather hard to do so. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the implications and the options I see for those in power to do something about that letter. So to start with the letter, the formulation, the timing, and the social media were all thought through. There are about 200 signatories. The group formed early. They put this piece together and decided Monday after Thanksgiving. People are full of, in the United States, gratefulness around Thanksgiving, and they thought, okay, what better time to release this nationally, send it to the Capitol, send it to the Pentagon, and put it out on Good Morning America. So the idea behind it was we need to make a splash in national security in the same way the other Me Too movement strands came out with a splash. Additionally, I'd like to note, if you look at those who signed the letter, there are phenomenal women. They're all women. Most are former members of the U.S. executive branch, the preponderance. And the reason I stress that is because the implications in the letter are those inside, you need to do something about it. About 10% are folks currently serving, but there was almost this last administration to next administration undertone that I do think can create them and us approach when you look at it. Additionally, the umbrella is very big. So any of us who worked for the U.S. government realize it is not a small bureaucracy. The Defense Department alone, we're talking about over 1.3 million individuals, not to count all the contractors and others who also support our military, our armed forces, and our national security apparatus. That said, within the executive branch, more than 50% are members or supporting the Defense Department. And then ultimately, one other point of the letter itself, if you look through it, beyond the recommendations it lays out and skewed or select statistics involved, are the goal it brings about is really a culture of respect for women. So going straight to that goal, I would suggest that really our goal is a more effective workforce to secure our nation that requires authenticity, professionalism, teamwork, and diversity. The focus is what we need to be doing, not just how we need to work with each other. So given that, a couple of the issues that I would like to suggest with regards to the letter are as follows. First, there is this conflation when we talk about sexual harassment and sexual assault. I, for one, am very concerned about this because to me, if you are familiar with the schools of relativism and universalism, I would put sexual assault into an absolute, it is wrong. And when you bring them all together, you have this spectrum for those who are trying to deal with this meaty topic as to how to respond. In terms of relativism, I think if we try to shift sexual harassment into this universal consideration, there are too many definitions to try to get our arms around that. Which then brings me to the concern of implicit versus explicit effects or reactions to sexual harassment. On one hand, we can say, zero tolerance, this is all wrong. On the other hand, from the implicit side, will you end up hurting the workforce more through implicit changes that take into account a fear of being perceived as someone who has conducted something that is perceived as sexual harassment? And a big argument with this is, yes, the implicit outcomes could ultimately be worse for the workforce and the goals of the workforce than the explicit changes it could bring about. The other point on the letter itself is that looking at the DoD culture versus other cultures within the U.S. government, you also have to think about tactical versus strategic echelons of units, teams, and workforces. At a tactical level, inclusivity as a sailor or inclusivity as a soldier and feeling discriminated is, I think, altogether different from being on a joint interagency high-level task force, where I would almost postulate that by being a representative in a very diverse team, everyone is discriminated against because everyone has biases as to how they see the civilian who represents this agency or the person in uniform. In the same way a uniform tells a story, so does one's experience at a strategic level. So I do think that needs to be kept in mind when teams are put together and when we talk about sexual harassment. Our colleague, General Meade from Jamaica, I thought put it brilliantly when he said, in creating parity, sometimes we create disparity. To move on, though, I do think that one other issue with this is it's a very open-ended letter that lists a series of demands, many of which, if you go down that list, are all some programs currently in effect and have been evolving and improving for the last decade or more in the Defense Department. I recently went overseas to the unit I'm supposed to be joining in about 2 months, and before I even had my first in-brief, I was handed a guide for all things sexual harassment from the U.S. government perspective and from the NATO perspective. Phone numbers, policies, everything is cited. So as we continue to demand more, I wonder, are we going to see more of these pamphlets, or are we going to see a more effective workforce where we get past those implicit biases? To this end, I'm not totally sure. So to share a couple of my personal experiences that drew me to these conclusions. For the better part of 2 decades, I've been working for the most homogenous parts of the United States government. I worked for 1st Armored Division, which is combat arms, as my first assignment out of working in and outside of New York City after 9/11 in the private sector. So given that, I am used to being the only woman in pretty much every room. Fast forward past some Pentagon and overseas time, I've been with Special Operations Command for going on 8 years now. I can tell you I am the only woman in almost every room. For a long time, I was the only woman at a deputy director level, and therefore I was included intentionally more often than not because there was a desire to figure out how to get better in this space. On that front, though, of course, I have felt discriminated against. I have been a victim of harassment. But I do believe most people in some stage and phase, man or woman in careers, tend to have this experience. So to polarize it as this is a problem women are facing and the group doing it as men is also problematic. I'd like to share just one story. I was briefing a 4-star general who's a combatant commander, and at his commander's conference, all of his subordinate commanders were there. 2 of my note takers were an Army colonel and a Marine major. And as they were taking notes on a whiteboard as I was giving a presentation on our upcoming posture statement on the Hill, one of my officers overheard 2 senior flag officers talking about my physique to the point where he felt the people around him could not even concentrate on the briefer or the presentation. Now, this is just one corner of the room. But when my presentation was wrapped up and I went through questions and answers with this group of flag officers, this officer came to me and said, "You need to do something about that. That is not acceptable. Those officers should not be there. They are setting the wrong example." And that major heard everything that they said. And I said, okay, well, let's get together and let's talk about this. And when I talked through it with them, what I found was the major and the colonel on my team, and we brought in other officers on my team, were all acutely aware of the fact that there are people in the force that do that, and it is not acceptable, and it does not help team cohesion. So my choices at that point in time were, do I make a mountain out of this, or do I let it go? And I had one officer who wanted me to make a mountain out of it. I did not. I let my first line boss know, who was a 1-star, and I said, I do not want to do anything about this because I am aware of the implicit implications. So while those officers could have a stern talking to or a counseling statement, ultimately I think it would make not just those officers but others more afraid to talk to women, interact with women, or say anything in the presence of women that could be considered harassment. And many do. So when I brought this paper to the attention of my classmates at the War College, I was shocked by some of the results I heard. These are field grade officers, some of whom said, I will have a closed door meeting with a man, but I will never have one with a woman. And by the way, I have been the only woman in 2 out of 3 of my seminars, and I shared the space with another female Navy officer. Another officer in the program said, when people go TDY, when they travel for work, if it's just men, one rental car. If they're men and women, separate rental cars. And the policies, implicit and explicit, go on and on and on. There's this buffer that gets created when there's this fear of being judged as harassing the opposite sex, that enables, or it disables, I think, not just inclusivity, but productivity and diversity. So to move back to close that up and where we go, has anyone here heard of the Pence rule?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, Mike Pence will not have a meeting with a woman, will not have a meal with a woman other than his wife. Has anyone heard of the Rock test? Okay, thank you, 1. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. There are a number of these things popping up, and it sounds funny, but the theory there was this is how you fix Me Too. Whenever you look at a woman, think of The Rock, the wrestler, and pretend you're talking to him. And then you'll never be considered sexually harassing her. And on one hand, we say this with tongue-in-cheek, oh, well, that's funny. On the other hand, how do you get to the diversity and the value of a diverse team if you refuse to see people for who they actually are because you're so afraid of seeing them for who they actually are that you just put up veneers? And that is my biggest concern on the implicit side of this movement. So, DoD options for the way ahead, and I'm checking my time when I look at this. First, the chairman and the secretary, and I'm focusing on DoD because that's what I know, but also because it's more than 50% of the workforce. They could ignore it, right? They could cleverly discard it by saying, well, there's your checklist. I've done all of these programs, and let me tell you, Congress, how I've done them, and here we go. They could tweak the sexual harassment and sexual assault programs in the Defense Department. Minor changes. One of the suggestions is exit interviews. I know that not the entire DoD practices exit interviews when people leave, so they could put that into effect. They could push this down to the services and say, each service, each unit, you need to craft an appropriate program, which would be slightly better because I do believe there's a huge difference at a tactical level versus a strategic level in the realm of sexual harassment and sexual assault. A little better, they could start planning for the implicit. Now, if you plan for the implicit, there are different ways to do this. One way I've seen after a few years on Capitol Hill is setting up commissions and requiring reports. You could come out with a 300-page report on all the problems and all the opportunity space. And that would be a great desk weight for future papers. But I don't know if that would actually solve the number of implicit issues that are a part of culture that takes time to evolve and is actively evolving right now. Finally, I think that they need to start with a four-star whiteboarding session. They all get together quarterly, all the commanders of 4-star level units and the service chiefs, the chairman and the secretary. They need experts like the ones in this room. They need to carve out time and develop realistic goals that address implicit and explicit issues within this space. I do think that they need to share best practices, and I do think that the conversation needs to be made public once they have their private sessions to keep the inertia behind it so we don't fall back on the Pence rule and the rock test and separate cars when we go TDY and the inability to have a conversation with a female subordinate in the same way you have a conversation with a male subordinate if you are a male leader. So I do think that Jennifer's briefing, for example, would be a great pre-session to the first whiteboarding session for those 4 stars because there's a lot of room to grow. And I do just want to say one more thing. I thank this organization for this opportunity to write this paper and present it because it's been 15 minutes. Actually, I started it about 30 seconds early. I shared my paper with a now geographic combatant commander who was that 4-star when I gave that briefing. And he came back to me and followed up with me on that topic. And he told me he was glad I handled it that way, but he was even more glad that he knows about that challenge now. So there is a way to do it with discretion to advance ourselves as a collective workforce towards better national security. Thank you.
Well, again, a thank you to everybody, and because now we do have time for questions, and I'm sure there are questions to be answered. So, hands in the back.
I'm Kevin Gessler from Managerial Staff College in Portland. I was just curious, why do you think the Pence rule and I've never heard of the rock
Test.
Rock test. I've never heard that's kind of fun. What's the cause of that? What do you think that is the predominant paradigm, if you will?
My personal opinion is this feeling that one has to protect themselves because it is so easy to end a career, even if it's based on a subjective judgment call. So the best way to do that is to create a mile-wide buffer where nothing could be misconstrued. And I do think that there is blame to be had on both sides of the male and female debate about this as to how it got to that place.
Ms. Hayes?
Yes, I know we talked a little bit this morning. If you could touch on how you see how other women treat women in leadership. So we tend to be critical of ourselves, let alone men being critical of our skill set. So Jennifer, I know you touched on a little bit of that in the leadership brief, so I'd like to hear what your opinions are.
Yeah, I think most women, wherever their position of leadership or the role that they're in, certainly has at least one or more examples about how there's been some unusual competitiveness between other women in their workspaces or in their fields. I honestly don't know why we do this to each other. I certainly have my own experiences and recommendations, but I think it continues to be a challenge, and I think that we have an opportunity to have an open discussion about it, and let's talk about why that happens, but let's try to move on from that. I really appreciate what LeAnne is saying in her paper about creating artificial rules that you could apply even to competitive relationships between women. I think the focus needs to be on holding each other to higher standards and to speaking out when people, including women, are unfairly competitive or trying to undercut each other, or backhanded compliments, or these biting sort of remarks that sometimes can be said about each other. I think it's about having a higher degree of integrity and holding ourselves and our peers to a higher standard. I'm not necessarily agree that we need to have more regulation or policies or notebooks, although I appreciate the intent of what that's trying to do. That's an education. But at the end of the day, there's an individual decision made by an individual decision maker to choose to make that remark or to view someone in that light. And I don't think any amount of regulation or well-crafted notebooks will really fix that. So to me, it's all about integrity and higher standards. And that really comes down to an individual level, my perspective.
Admiral?
Let me tell you, I'm really impressed by your speech. Really impressed. I think it's worth it coming here just to listen to you. Okay. I'm also impressed by the Me Too That Not Check letter. It's difficult to me to say the name. When you read that letter, that is written 6 months ago, 10 months ago. Looking from outside, you say, okay. You are exactly like 40 years ago. And you have written many things. You have all the regulations. You have a lot of, a big road already of experience. And it seems to me that you're not advancing. Okay? And that's concerned me because we are at the beginning of the road. Okay? Now, if you try to measure, to really measure what the real effect of what is going on, especially in sexual harassment and sexual abuse. I guess you start measuring this 40 years ago. Are you getting better or is it exactly the same? And I'm asking the three of you. Are you getting better? Do you have hope that you're getting better? Are you measuring the percentage of sexual assaults? Or you're exactly frozen 40 years ago? That's the question I would like to ask the three of you.
I have the statistics on that, but again, that's on the explicit side. Essentially, reporting has gone way up, and the number of incidents has gone down. So depending on which statistic you use, if you go, oh, well, there are way more cases now being reported, so is the problem getting worse? Well, based on anonymous surveys, it seems like the trend line on assault and harassment is going down. That's why I bring up this explicit versus implicit. Because from egregious, explicit incidents, it seems that the line is truly going down, and those who are affected by it, the percentage of women or men who speak out when something like that happens has gone way up. So there's progress in that regard, I think, on the explicit side. But when you see a higher number of reporting, then of course you have to do more training. You have to talk about it. You have to make it more clear as to how to handle it.
And this is the next question about the same thing. So, do you have, in the lower level of the education, the primary, programs that basically are sympathetic or are coherent with all the issues that you have in the armed forces or the society? I mean, when you're in kindergarten, somebody said to your kid, sexual harassment is bad, so don't do it. So when you are a little child, you basically start behaving as a human being. Do you have something like that in society? I'm not sure, really.
I'll say yes, and I'll say that from the perspective of a mother with 2 small children. Catherine's 9, my other is 3 years old. And so in their education, I've seen discussions related around things like consent as an example. So we didn't have this when I was at the same age, but to talk about it's not okay to walk up to a girl and pull the back of her shirt like this. That's not appropriate. That was very commonplace when I was in school. It doesn't feel like that long ago, but I'm sure it was. But they have these discussions, and I think it's about creating an atmosphere where it is okay to have this conversation about this is what I think without someone being fearful that they will be judged in some way, but to say, let me share with you why you might want to consider an alternative. So they have, in at least in our educational experiences, discussions about consent as young as kindergarten and first grade. Personal space. If you feel like you are not having, or your consent is being invaded in some way, what do you do about that? How do you speak up and have a voice? It's okay to say, no, this isn't making me comfortable, even if that person is someone who's in a position of authority over you. And again, I don't think those were things that I certainly had in school, but understanding that you have a voice independent of your age or your gender or your position, I think is something that we are seeing, at least I see from my own perspective as a mom in the education system.
To add, human nature and culture are hard things to change, if we can change them at all. But I have 2 small kids as well, a boy and a girl. And my son has told me, Mommy, you can't work for the military. You can't be a soldier. And this is just from television or what have you. And when he role plays with my daughter, he tells her, no, you can't be that character. That's a boy. You can't be the Hulk. And we've had to break him of this. We've had to say, you all can be whatever you want to be. She can be whatever she wants. You can be whatever you want. But I hope that more of us are going in that direction. And yet the icons in society are still slightly shifting this story back to traditional roles. I don't think we're there yet. And I do think that there is an element of interest that applies as well. We can't forget a lot of people go into certain fields because it aligns with what they like to do. Be it special forces, they like to be outside. They like to climb things, they like to destroy things. And that sometimes lends itself to one side, more men than women.
I think certainly also the climate and the conditions for change are different now. So we're fighting for different things. We're depending less on our legal system to fight these issues for us. And now we're being confronted with the reality that the legal system and our social systems aren't confronting these problems adequately. So now we're realizing that this is a deeply cultural, gendered issue that we have to attack from different angles and through different ways. But I think it's certainly promising that the reporting is going up, because it shows that women and men who experience sexual misconduct are empowered to say this is wrong, which certainly wasn't the case in previous decades. And I think the fact that we're sitting here today talking about these issues is also very promising. And the fact that we are moving on women, peace, and security finally is promising to me.
And unfortunately, this panel did generate the questions and conversations that I was sure it would. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I apologize to every one of those who had their hands up and were waiting. I would have got to, but unfortunately, we'll have to continue this later on throughout the day. It's been an honor to serve. Thank you very much.